The Intergalactic Academy of Xenobiology sat perched on the third moon of Yelthos Prime, a gleaming monument to the pursuit of knowledge that had been collecting dust and doctoral candidates for the past 4 centuries. Its crystalline spires reached toward the void with the kind of architectural arrogance that screamed, "We know everything about everything, and we have 17 peer-reviewed journals to prove it." The institution prided itself on cataloging every sentient species in the known galaxy, from the methane-breathing philosophers of Sector 9 to the microscopic hive minds that had accidentally been nominated for a literature prize. Their database was exhaustive, their methodology was rigorous, and their certainty was absolute, which made it particularly entertaining that they were completely wrong about humans. The morning light filtered through the dome of Lecture Hall 73, casting prismatic patterns across rows of students who represented 47 different species, each more confident than the last that they were about to master the finer points of mythological xenobiology, debunked species and folklore fauna. It was an elective course, popular among upperclassmen who enjoyed the academic equivalent of a leisurely stroll after years of actual challenging coursework. The syllabus promised discussions of beings that various primitive cultures had invented to explain natural phenomena they were too underdeveloped to understand properly. Dragons, phoenixes, the crystalline weavers of Andromeda's third arm, and human. Our protagonist sat in the back row, which was really more of a hovering platform designed to accommodate the Flothorian students who found traditional seating oppressive to their gas bladder anatomy. They had arrived at the academy 3 days prior with a full scholarship, impeccable forged credentials, and the kind of mounting dread usually reserved for tax audits and surprise family reunions. The scholarship paperwork, written in the tiny font that legal departments across the universe apparently agreed upon in some sort of cosmic conspiracy, had one very specific clause buried in subsection 47, paragraph 12. Addendum C. The recipient must not reveal their true species identity during the course of their studies, as the scholarship was specifically designed to promote cultural exchange through immersive anonymity. The irony was not lost on them. The one human in the entire academy, sitting in a class about how humans definitely did not exist, legally obligated to pretend they were anything but. They had opted for a Valerian disguise, which involved approximately 17 holographic projectors hidden in their clothing and a concerning amount of makeup. Valerians were conveniently bipedal, mammalian enough to pass casual inspection, and common enough that nobody asked too many questions. Also, their tendency toward extreme social anxiety was culturally accepted, which meant our protagonist could avoid most interpersonal interactions without raising suspicion. Professor Helixand entered the lecture hall with the kind of sweeping dramatic flair that suggested he had practiced the movement in front of a mirror for years. His species, the Quarlinthy, possessed 12 manipulator appendages and a head that rotated a full 360 degrees, which he used to maximum theatrical effect. He settled behind the podium, 3 of his limbs arranging lecture notes while 2 more operated the holographic display system with the confidence of someone who had never been contradicted in his entire academic career. "Welcome, welcome," he announced, his voice resonating through translation implants that rendered his chittering speech pattern into something approaching standard galactic. "I am Professor Helixand, and I have dedicated the past 60 years to the study of mythological beings that various cultures have created to cope with their existential inadequacy. This semester, we will explore the fascinating psychology behind these fabrications, and perhaps learn something about the nature of belief itself." The holographic display flickered to life, showing a rotating image that made our protagonist's jaw clench involuntarily. It was or rather what the Academy's artistic department thought a human might look like if humans had existed, which they obviously did not. The proportions were almost right, except the arms were slightly too long, the eyes were an alarming shade of violet, that had never occurred in human genetics, and for some inexplicable reason, the artist had given it 3 fingers per hand instead of 5. "Behold, Professor Helixand declared, gesturing dramatically at the image, the so-called human, according to the mythology, primarily propagated by the inhabitants of Sector Terra. These beings supposedly evolved on a Class M planet, and achieved spaceflight through chemical propulsion. Adorable, really, in its implausibility." A student in the third row, whose species resembled a particularly enthusiastic cluster of tentacles, raised one appendage. "Professor, what makes humans particularly mythological? We have records of Sector Terra, and the databases show significant industrial signatures. An excellent question, Professor Helixand responded, clearly delighted. The sector terra phenomenon is actually a fascinating case study in collective delusion. What we observe are automated systems left behind by the progenitor species that seeded that region approximately 50,000 years ago. The industrial signatures are simply maintenance protocols continuing to function long after their creators departed. As for humans themselves, the biological impossibilities are staggering. He manipulated the display, and a series of diagrams appeared, each one annotated with scholarly precision and complete nonsense. Consider the proposed skeletal structure, a purely bipedal stance with no tail for counterbalance, no secondary support limbs, and a spine that allegedly allows them to walk upright for extended periods. The mechanical stress alone would be excruciating. Every reputable xenobiologist agrees that such a design would result in chronic pain and structural failure within a few years of maturity. Our protagonist shifted uncomfortably in their seat, acutely aware of their own spine, which had been handling the mechanical stress just fine for 2 decades. Thank you very much. The lower back pain from that time they helped move furniture did not count as structural failure. Furthermore, the professor continued, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been proven wrong. The mythology claims humans possess a largely internal skeleton made of calcium-based compounds, covered by soft tissue with minimal protective features. No scales, no chitin, no subdermal armor plating. They would be vulnerable to essentially every environmental hazard imaginable. What about clothing? Another student asked. This one was heptarchian, their crystalline form refracting the lecture hall lights into rainbow patterns. Many species use artificial protection. True, but the human mythology takes this to absurd extremes. They allegedly required artificial protection for even mild temperature variations, couldn't withstand their own planet's solar radiation without chemical interventions, and lacked any natural defense mechanisms whatsoever. No venom, no claws, no bioelectric discharge capability. How does a species reach evolutionary dominance while being so catastrophically fragile? The answer, of course, is that it does not. The entire concept violates fundamental principles of natural selection. The lecture continued in this vein for another 40 minutes, each point more confidently incorrect than the last. Humans allegedly could not exist because their brain-to-body mass ratio would cause thermal regulation problems. Their binocular vision would provide inadequate environmental awareness. Their reproduction cycle was inefficient to the point of comedy. Their dietary requirements were so specific that they would have never survived their planet's prehistoric period. Our protagonist took notes, because that was what students did, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that they had eaten synthesized paste for breakfast that morning, specifically because the Academy's dining facilities did not stock anything compatible with human digestive system, or that they were currently maintaining their body temperature through sheer mammalian stubbornness, or that their brain was functioning perfectly well despite its allegedly problematic thermal output. For your first assignment, Professor Helixand announced as the lecture drew to a close, I want each of you to select one mythological species from our database and prepare a presentation explaining why their existence is biologically untenable. Use scientific principles, reference established xenobiological theory, and be creative. This should be enjoyable. Students began filing out their various methods of locomotion, creating a chaotic symphony of movement. Our protagonist remained seated, staring at their notes, contemplating the extremely specific kind of hell they had signed up for. 11 weeks. 11 weeks of listening to detailed explanations of why they could not possibly exist. 11 weeks of nodding along while professors and classmates dissected every aspect of human biology and declared it fantasy. 11 weeks of pretending to be Valerian, while their actual species was being used as the academic equivalent of a comedy routine. The scholarship was worth it. The education was prestigious. The opportunities were unparalleled. But as our protagonist finally stood and made their way toward the exit, they could not help but wonder if there was some cosmic entity somewhere, laughing at the exquisite absurdity of the situation. A human, sitting in a classroom full of aliens, learning about why humans were impossible, legally forbidden from correcting any of it. They had 11 weeks to maintain this charade. This was going to be educational in ways the Academy had definitely not intended. Week 2 began with cardiovascular systems, and Professor Helixand arrived with the kind of manic energy that suggested he had spent the entire break period preparing what he clearly considered his masterpiece of debunkery. The holographic display showed a pulsating diagram of a human heart, rendered in colors that did not occur in nature, and animated with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for horror film. The alleged human circulatory system, he announced, his 12 appendages gesturing with professorial enthusiasm, represents perhaps the most egregious biological fiction in the entire mythology. A single pump mechanism, operating continuously for the entire lifespan, with no redundancy, no backup systems, and no regenerative capacity. One catastrophic failure, and the entire organism ceases to function. A Draxian student, whose own species possessed 17 hearts distributed throughout their body cavity, made a sound that the translation implant rendered as deeply skeptical laughter. That is genuinely absurd. What kind of evolutionary pressure would produce such a fragile design? Exactly my point, Professor Helixand responded with visible satisfaction. No apex species would survive with such vulnerability, and the mythology becomes even more entertaining when we examine the oxygen transport mechanism. These beings supposedly relied on iron-based hemoglobin, which is among the least efficient oxygen carriers known to xenobiology. Our protagonist resisted the urge to mention that their iron-based hemoglobin was currently working perfectly well, transporting oxygen through their definitely real cardiovascular system, without any backup hearts required. Their single heart maintained its steady rhythm, blissfully unaware that it was being used as evidence of humanity's fictional status. By week 3 the class had moved on to metabolism, and the theories had achieved new heights of creative wrongness. Professor Helixand dedicated 2 full lectures to explaining why human dietary requirements represented a biological impossibility that violated thermodynamic principles. The human mythology claims they were omnivorous, capable of processing both plant and animal matter, yet requiring specific micronutrients in precise quantities, he explained, manipulating charts that showed caloric requirements and nutritional breakdowns that were almost but not quite accurate. Too much of certain compounds, and they allegedly experienced toxic reactions. Too little, and they developed systemic failures. They supposedly needed to consume food multiple times per day, every single day, or face deterioration. That sounds exhausting, commented a photosyntherian student, who had not eaten anything in the conventional sense for 3 months. It gets worse, Professor Helixand continued with evident delight. The mythology suggests they could not synthesize their own amino acids, and required external sources for 8 different essential compounds. They could not produce their own vitamin C and would develop a fatal condition without dietary supplementation. They allegedly required a specific strain of bacteria in their digestive systems to process certain foods, and would become ill if this bacterial balance was disrupted. The class collectively made sounds that their various translation implants rendered as variations of disbelief. Our protagonist sat very still, thinking about the vitamin supplements hidden in their dormitory room, and the extremely careful dietary planning required to maintain basic health, while living on a space station, designed for beings who considered eating an optional recreational activity. They had lost 4 pounds since arriving. Their digestive system was mounting a protest that could probably be detected from orbit. Week 4 introduced neurology, and Professor Helixand unveiled his theory that human brain chemistry represented the mythology's most obvious flaw. The alleged human nervous system operated on electrical impulses, transmitted through sodium-potassium pumps, which is pedestrian enough, but the mythology claims their higher cognitive functions required a specific balance of neurotransmitters that could be disrupted by minor variations in diet, sleep patterns, or environmental factors. He paused for dramatic effect, 3 of his appendages, adjusting the holographic display to show a cross-section of a human brain that had extra lobes in places where lobes definitely did not belong. These beings supposedly experienced mood alterations based on sunlight exposure. They required approximately 8 hours of unconsciousness per day, or suffered cognitive degradation. Their decision-making capabilities were allegedly compromised by something called hunger, which the mythology describes as a painful signal that demanded immediate attention. What kind of apex predator becomes intellectually impaired because they missed lunch? The Heptarchian student from week 1 refracted thoughtfully. It does seem counterproductive to survival. Our species can operate at full cognitive capacity for weeks without nutrient intake. Precisely, Professor Helixand agreed, and we have not even discussed their alleged emotional volatility. The mythology suggests humans experienced something called stress responses that flooded their systems with hormones that actively impaired rational thought. Adrenaline rushes that caused trembling and reduced fine motor control. Cortisol production that suppressed immune function. They apparently evolved a biological system that made them less capable during dangerous situations. Our protagonist's stress hormones were definitely activating at that moment, flooding their very real human body with cortisol that was probably suppressing their immune function, exactly as the mythology described. The irony was physically uncomfortable. By week 6, the lectures had transitioned from biological systems to cultural analysis, which somehow made everything worse. Professor Helixand had invited a guest speaker, Professor Weinleth from the Department of Comparative Anthropology, whose specialization was the psychological analysis of species that invented fictional relatives. The human mythology, Professor Weinleth explained in a voice that sounded like wind chimes having an existential crisis, represents a fascinating case of aspirational fiction. The cultures of Sector Terra created an idealized version of themselves, a species that had overcome their limitations through ingenuity rather than evolution. The holographic display showed what the Academy's researchers believed were human artifacts. They had correctly identified a spacecraft fragment, but had somehow concluded it was a religious icon. A photograph of Earth had been classified as an artistic representation of an impossible planet, with excessive water coverage. A recording of human music had been analyzed and determined to be a mathematical proof rendered in audio format. Note the mythology's emphasis on tool use and technological innovation, Professor Weinleth continued. The fictional humans supposedly reached spaceflight capability, despite their biological limitations. They built cities, developed complex languages, created art and literature. This represents wish fulfillment by the actual inhabitants of Sector Terra, whoever they might be, projecting their desires onto an imaginary species that achieved greatness through determination rather than natural superiority. A student whose species resembled an ambulatory fern raised one frond-like appendage. But Professor, if humans are fictional, who created the industrial signatures in Sector Terra? An excellent question with a straightforward answer, Professor Weinleth responded. The progenitors, obviously. The same species that seeded life throughout this galactic sector, left automated systems in Sector Terra. The local inhabitants, possibly descended from progenitor maintenance drones, created the human mythology to explain their own existence, and the technology they did not understand. Our protagonist experienced what might charitably be called an academic out-of-body experience. They were sitting in a lecture hall, listening to two professors, with multiple advanced degrees explain in precise academic language why they personally, sitting right there in the third row, were actually a maintenance drone suffering from delusions of humanity. Week 7 brought locomotion studies, and Professor Helix, and returned with renewed enthusiasm to explain why bipedal movement represented biological fiction at its finest. Consider the energy expenditure, he said, showing comparative charts that analyzed the efficiency of various movement methods. The alleged human gait cycle required continuous balance adjustments, constant muscular engagement, and provided no speed advantages over quadrupedal movement. They supposedly achieved maximum running speeds of barely 30 kilometers per hour, which would make them prey for virtually any predator larger than themselves. Did the mythology explain how they survived their planet's evolutionary pressures? Asked the Draxian student. Tool use, apparently, Professor Helix, and responded with what could only be described as academic amusement. The mythology claims they compensated for every biological inadequacy with technology. No claws, manufacture knives. No natural armor, create protective coverings. Inadequate speed, invent vehicles. It is rather convenient that their solution to being biologically implausible
was to simply imagine compensatory inventions. Our protagonist looked down at their hands, which possessed the standard 5 fingers that the Academy's artistic department had somehow reduced to 3. These hands had built things, written things, held things, done thousands of tasks that required exactly the kind of opposable thumb dexterity that Professor Helixand was currently explaining could not possibly exist. Week 8's lecture focused on reproduction, and our protagonist seriously considered dropping the class. Scholarship be damned.
Week 9 arrived with an announcement that landed like a meteor strike on our protagonist's already fragile academic existence. Professor Helixand distributed the final exam requirements with the kind of cheerful demeanor that suggested he had no idea he was about to ruin someone's entire semester. Your final examination will be a research paper, he declared, his appendages distributing data tablets to each student with mechanical efficiency. Select any mythological species from our curriculum and construct an original argument disproving their existence. I want fresh perspectives, creative analysis, and rigorous application of xenobiological principles. This paper will constitute 40% of your final grade. Our protagonist stared at the assignment parameters with the kind of existential horror usually reserved for philosophical discussions about mortality. Write a paper disproving human existence, using scientific evidence. While being human, the universe apparently had a sense of humor that bordered on sadistic. The ethical crisis that had been simmering for 8 weeks reached a full boil. They had spent 2 months nodding along to lectures that invalidated their entire existence, maintaining a holographic disguise that itched in places they could not scratch in public, and eating nutritionally inadequate meals that made their very real human digestive system contemplate mutiny. The scholarship required silence. Academic integrity demanded honesty. Their survival instincts suggested possibly faking their own death and fleeing to a neighboring galaxy. Week 10 brought the lecture that finally pushed them past the breaking point. Professor Helixand had dedicated the entire session to debunking human emotional capacity and creative expression, which he presented as the mythology's most obviously fabricated elements. The human mythology claims these beings experienced complex emotions that influenced their behavior in unpredictable ways, he explained, displaying charts that categorized human emotions with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for cataloging bacteria. Loves, supposedly, could override survival instincts. Grief could cause physical illness. Anger could impair judgment for extended periods. Joy could make them weep, which the mythology presents as a positive response. Somehow, he manipulated the display to show what the Academy believed were examples of human art. A painting had been analyzed and determined to be a navigational chart. A piece of sculpture had been classified as a tool whose purpose remained mysterious. A novel had been translated and dismissed as an instruction manual, with excessive narrative embellishment. Note the mythology's insistence that humans created art for purely aesthetic purposes, with no practical application. Professor Helixand continued. They allegedly wrote stories that served no educational function, composed music that conveyed no tactical information, and created visual works simply because they found them pleasing. This represents perhaps the most inefficient use of cognitive resources ever proposed in speculative xenobiology. Something in our protagonist's carefully maintained composure cracked. They had spent 10 weeks being told they were impossible. They had tolerated lectures explaining why their spine should not work, why their heart was inadequately designed, why their brain chemistry made them unsuited for survival. But dismissing human creativity as logistically implausible fiction crossed a line they had not known existed. Their hand went up before their survival instinct could intervene. Yes? Professor Helixand acknowledged them with 2 appendages while 3 others continued manipulating the display. What if, our protagonist began, their voice carefully modulated through the translation implant to sound appropriately Valerian. The art served a survival function that we simply do not recognize. What if emotional expression in creative works provided psychological resilience that enhanced long-term survival rates? The professor's head rotated a full 180 degrees, which apparently indicated contemplation in Quarlanthy body language. An interesting hypothesis, but it contradicts established evolutionary theory. Traits that do not provide immediate survival advantages are selected against. Art requires resource investment with no measurable return. Unless, our protagonist pressed, their careful months of silence crumbling like wet paper. The measurable return exists in areas we have not examined. social cohesion, mental health, collective memory. What if humans, hypothetically, used storytelling to pass survival knowledge between generations? What if music strengthened community bonds that improved group survival rates? What if creating beauty in harsh environments provided the psychological fortitude necessary to overcome challenges? The classroom had gone silent, various species turning their attention toward the back row where a supposedly anxious Valerian was delivering an impassioned defense of human emotional complexity. Professor Helixand's appendages still. You seem remarkably invested in defending a fictional species. Should we not examine all possibilities before dismissing them as mythology? The evidence has been examined extensively, the professor responded, but something in his tone suggested uncertainty had entered the conversation. Multiple research institutions have concluded that the biological implausibilities outweigh any theoretical advantages. Have those research institutions ever encountered an actual human? The question emerged before our protagonist could stop it, and the classroom's silence deepened into something approaching vacuum density. That would be difficult, Professor Helixand said slowly, considering they do not exist. Our protagonist opened their mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. 10 weeks of frustration, dietary deficiency, and existential absurdity were competing for expression. The scholarship contract sat in their memory like a legal landmine. The holographic disguise continued projecting Valerian features over their very human face. 47 classmates watched with various sensory organs as something unprecedented unfolded. Perhaps, they finally said, each word carefully selected, our certainty about their non-existence deserves re-examination. They spent the rest of the lecture asking pointed questions. When Professor Helixand explained why human tear ducts served no biological purpose, they inquired about emotional regulation through physical relief. When he dismissed human laughter as mythological fancy, they questioned whether vocalized joy might strengthen social bonds in species lacking telepathic capability. When he declared human curiosity evolutionarily counterproductive, they suggested that investigative behavior might provide adaptive advantages in changing environments. By the lecture's end, 3 other students had joined the question. The Heptarchan wanted to know if the Sector Terra industrial signatures had been dated accurately. The Draxian asked whether bilateral symmetry might provide advantages the Academy had not considered. Even the Flothorian, who rarely spoke during class, wondered aloud if dismissing an entire species as mythology based purely on theoretical models represented sound scientific method. Professor Helixand dismissed them 15 minutes early, his appendages moving with agitation that suggested his absolute certainty had developed some uncomfortable crack. Our protagonist returned to their dormitory, removed the holographic projectors, and stared at their actual human face in the mirror. 11 weeks in a classroom that did not believe in humans, and they had just publicly defended their own existence without technically violating the scholarship terms. 4 weeks remained. One final exam loomed, and something in the Academy's absolute certainty had begun to crumble. Week 11 arrived with the atmosphere in Lecture Hall 73, transformed into something resembling academic civil war. Students had fractured into factions. The true believers who maintained humans were obviously mythological, the newly skeptical who had begun questioning the curricula, and a small but vocal group who had started conducting independent research into Sector Terra, with the kind of enthusiasm that made professors nervous. Professor Helixand entered the classroom with noticeably less dramatic flair than usual. His appendages moved with uncertain efficiency as he arranged his notes, and his head rotated less confidently. The past week had apparently been difficult for someone whose entire career rested on the certainty that humans represented biological impossibility. Today, he announced, his voice lacking its usual professorial smugness, we will discuss final exam submissions and address some recent challenges to established xenobiological theory. Our protagonists sat in their usual position, holographic disguise active, heart pounding with very real human anxiety. They had made a decision sometime around 3 in the morning, lying in their dormitory bed, staring at the ceiling, contemplating the specific flavor of absurdity that had become their academic existence. The scholarship required them not to reveal their species' identity during their study. Technically, their studies concluded when final exams were submitted. Technically, the final exam was due to Technically, they could maintain the requirement until approximately 4 minutes before the revelation that would either validate their entire ordeal or get them expelled from the most prestigious xenobiology institution in the known galaxy. Several students have raised questions. Professor Helixand continued, manipulating the display with 3 appendages, while 2 others fidgeted nervously, regarding the certainty with which we classify certain species as mythological. While I stand by the established research, I acknowledge that scientific inquiry requires openness to new evidence. The Heptarchan student refracted with satisfaction. Does this mean you are reconsidering the human classification? I am reconsidering nothing, Professor Helixand replied, his certainty attempting a comeback. However, I am willing to examine any credible evidence that suggests alternative interpretations. Our protagonist stood up. The movement drew attention from 47 pairs of eyes, stalks, sensory organs, and 1 student who perceived reality through EK. They reached into their bag and withdrew a data tablet containing their final exam submission, walking down the aisle toward the professor's podium with the kind of deliberate calm that preceded either triumph or spectacular failure. I have credible evidence, they said quietly. Professor Helixand accepted the tablet, 2 appendages activating the display while others maintained defensive positioning, as though preparing for the academic equivalent of an attack. His eyes, all 6 of them, scanned the title of the submitted paper, An Empirical Analysis of Human Existence, through direct observation. Why I know humans are real because I am one. The lecture hall's silence achieved a density that could probably collapse into a singularity. This is not an acceptable thesis title, Professor Helixand said slowly. Read the paper, our protagonist replied. The professor read, his appendages stilled. His head stopped rotating. Various students leaned forward, their curiosity overriding their certainty. Our protagonist reached up and deactivated the holographic projectors one by one, the Valerian disguise dissolving like morning fog. They stood there completely human, with their bilateral symmetry and their inadequate cardiovascular system, and their inefficient metabolism, and their opposable thumbs and their binocular vision, and every other biological feature that Professor Helixand had spent 11 weeks explaining could not possibly exist. I have been sitting in this classroom, they said into the stunned silence, for 11 weeks, listening to detailed explanations of why I am biologically impossible, taking notes on my own anatomical inadequacies, nodding along while you used my species as an academic joke, and I can confirm definitively that humans are real, because I have been maintaining this fragile, implausible, mythological body for the entire semester, without collapsing from mechanical spine failure. Professor Helixand made a sound that the translation implants struggled to process. Several students began vocalizing in their native languages, creating a cacophony that suggested simultaneous confusion, excitement, and existential recalibration. But the scholarship, the professor finally managed. The Valerian exchange program was designed to promote cultural understanding through anonymous integration. Our protagonist explained, I could not reveal my identity during my studies. My studies concluded approximately 4 minutes ago when I submitted my final exam. My identity is now revealed. The scholarship terms have been satisfied. They pulled out a second data tablet, this one containing official documentation. I also have correspondence here from the Academy's administration, dated 3 days ago, confirming that if I successfully proved human existence, through my attendance, the scholarship would be honored and I would receive academic credit for completing the most elaborate extracurricular research project in institutional history. The Draxian student began laughing, a sound like grinding tectonic plate. You attended a class about your own non-existence for 11 weeks. I did, and used your own existence as your final thesis. Correct. That is the most human thing I have ever heard of, and I did not believe you existed until 30 seconds ago. Professor Helixand's appendages slowly reanimated. He looked at the human standing before him, then at the paper on his tablet, then at the 47 students whose entire understanding of xenobiology had just been reconstructed, in real time. His head rotated through a full 360 degrees, which apparently indicated profound academic distress. My career, he said weakly, will be fine,
our protagonist assured him. You are now the professor who confirmed human existence through direct classroom observation. That is considerably more prestigious than being the professor who taught mythology. You will probably get published in multiple journals. But everything I taught was wrong. Not everything. You were completely correct about the spine problems. My lower back has been killing me for weeks. The laugh started with the Heptarchian, spread to the Flothorian, infected the Draxian, and eventually even Professor Helixand's appendages trembled with what might have been amusement, or horror, or possibly both. The Intergalactic Academy of Xenobiology, with its 4 centuries of confident certainty, had just been educated by the very species it had classified as folklore. Our protagonist returned to their seat, human face visible, holographic disguise deactivated, scholarship terms satisfied. Around them, students began asking approximately 8,000 questions. Simultaneously, Professor Helixand attempted to restore order, failed, and eventually joined the questioning himself. The curriculum, naturally, underwent immediate revision. By the following semester, Mythological Xenobiology had been renamed Applied Human Studies, and enrollment had tripled. Professor Helixand became the galaxy's foremost expert on humanity, a position he achieved through the humbling experience of being completely wrong in front of witnesses. As for our protagonist, they graduated with honors, published extensively on the experience of being mythological, and maintained a very real human existence that continued to work despite its theoretical impossibility. Somewhere in the administrative offices, someone updated the Academy's database. Under species classification, next to humanity, the status changed from mythological to confirmed extant. The notation included a footnote, considerably more stubborn than predicted.